Here's Justin Brierley from Unbelievable to give 4 very silly and unoriginal arguments for why it is more rational to believe in a God than to be an atheist.
A good place to start, though, would be to define the word rational. A simple definition might be that rational beliefs are those that are supported by good evidence, and that works for me.
You might also want to define what you mean by good evidence, because I suspect that you and I would differ about what constitutes such evidence.
In some ways, tonight I've taken the burden of proof on myself in the way the question has been worded. Is it rational to be a Christian? We might equally have asked, is it rational to be an atheist? Because at the end of the day, we all need to provide good reasons for what we believe.
You should be more specific about what you mean by atheist. If by atheist you mean someone who affirms the non-existence of a god, I agree, it's best to have reasons for that. However, if someone's one of those atheists who does not affirm the non-existence of a god, but simply is not convinced that there is one, I don't think that carries any burden of proof. Simply not being convinced of something is not a proposition which requires justification, because it isn't a proposition at all.
Nevertheless, I don't think the burden is too heavy on me, because actually I think it's possible to rationally be a Christian or to rationally be an atheist. People often have different but personally valid reasons for believing different things.
What do you mean by personally valid reasons? In what sense is validity personal?
And of course, what's really at stake isn't just, is it rational, but is it true? Because when it comes to atheism and Christianity, obviously at least one of them must be false.
Again, not if you're talking about the kind of atheism that is simply a lack of belief. A lack of a belief can't be true or false.
Today, I'm going to present what I think are objective evidences for the truth of Christianity.
Whenever I hear apologists talk about evidences, I think of when Arnie used to talk about giving other bodybuilders the wrong advices.
But as I say, I think you can rationally be a Christian even without objective evidence. Many people are Christians on the basis of some subjective experience, believing that Christ has in some way entered, shaped, or changed their life. And until they're given some other compelling reason not to trust that experience, I think they're justified in holding to it.
I agree with this in a William James sense. William James was a philosopher of religion who argued that sometimes if you feel a strong intuition that something is true, you are justified in believing in it, even without empirical evidence, as long as you only act on that belief at your own risk. By definition, proselytizers, like Justin here, are not content to merely believe at their own risk. They seek to convince others to believe and thus take on that risk themselves.
I'll be hoping to show tonight that it's more rational to be a Christian than to be an atheist. Specifically, atheist materialism is what I have in view, and I believe is the view Stephen holds, so he'll be able to tell us himself. It's the idea that ultimately all that exists is matter and energy in motion. There's no supernatural dimension to reality.
I think a broader view, which is compatible with materialism, is physicalism. The idea that only that which is physical exists. I think that to say that something exists and we have some kind of understanding of it, which we would have to understand what it would mean to say that it exists, is essentially to say that it's physical. Physical doesn't seem to have any specific meaning beyond that. As Noam Chomsky says,
the term physical is just kind of like an honorific word, kind of like the word real when we say the real truth. It doesn't add anything, it just says this is what serious truth. So to say that something's physical today just means you got to take it seriously. But there's no further concept of physical or material or body. Physical is just anything we more or less understand. And if that's the only notion of physical we have, there can't be interaction between physical and non-physical. Non-physical will be all the things we don't understand. If we ever get to understand them, they'll be physical.
By definition, we can't understand what it means to say that the supernatural exists, insofar as the supernatural is non-physical. The assertion that the non-physical exists is an assertion that, by definition, can never be understood. It can never have any meaning.
In my opinion, there are lots of aspects of reality that kind of atheist materialism fails to ultimately explain, but which Christianity makes good sense of.
By definition, the supernatural, insofar as we are to take it to mean non-physical, is that which can't make any sense of anything.
Firstly, I think God makes sense of human existence. Atheists often claim that science confirms atheism.
Citation needed. I have not seen atheists often claim that science confirms atheism. Rather, it simply consistently fails to corroborate theism.
But I disagree. I think lots of aspects of science point towards God.
A God would have to be coherently defined before that could possibly be the case. You can't point to something that has no coherent definition. If there is a coherent definition of the Abrahamic God, I haven't heard it.
For instance, the fine-tuning of the universe for life is this extraordinary phenomenon where it seems that when the universe came into being, which is itself a pretty remarkable fact, it was birthed with an amazingly precise set of values that govern the laws of nature, and they have to be just as they are for life to develop at some point in the cosmos.
Oh, this moldy old chestnut. Okay, first of all, the universe didn't come into being. To say that something comes into being is to say that there was a time when that thing did not exist, followed by a time when it does. Since there was no time when the universe, or multiverse as the case may be, did not exist, even if time itself is finite in the past, the universe cannot coherently be said to have come into being. Secondly, the idea that the universe was fine-tuned for life carries with it all kinds of theological problems. To say that life is impossible without the parameters the universe has is to say that the supposedly all-powerful Abrahamic God does not have the power to put life in a universe with different parameters. Another problem is that it implies that this God is himself not a form of life. Certainly God himself does not need a finely tuned universe in order to exist, because his existence doesn't seem contingent upon any universe, if he's timeless and spaceless, as the apologists tell us he is. So either God is not alive, or being alive does not require a finely tuned universe. Certainly a sentient entity does not require a finely tuned universe if a timeless, spaceless God does in fact exist.
For instance, if the gravitational constant differed from its actual value by 1 part in 10 to the 60, then stars wouldn't be able to form, which produce the specific chemicals needed for life to be possible. And that's just one of many examples, some of them far, far more unlikely.
So again, you're saying that your all-powerful God doesn't have the power to make those chemicals without stars.
So the fact that we're here, is it just a happy accident, as many atheists claim? Well, the chances seem so extraordinarily minute that the better hypothesis is that we were meant to be here, that there is in fact a designer behind the universe.
I don't claim that we are here because of a happy accident. I think that the parameters of the universe are as they are because, while we can imagine them being different, they were never actually free to vary. The apologist William Lane Craig says that we are either here due to chance, due to necessity, in other words, due to the parameters of the universe not actually being free to vary, or design. Chance is clearly unlikely, but I think design is also less likely than necessity, simply because of Occam's razor. Design assumes the existence of a mind that can control the universe. And I think the idea that the universe's parameters are simply not free to vary is a much more modest assumption. It doesn't require assuming the existence of a wholly unique kind of entity.
And even the fact we can do this sort of science is because the universe is written in the language of mathematics. Now, maths is an abstract subject that we can work out in our head, yet for some bizarre reason, it happens that the entire physical universe can be mapped out and predicted using its principles. It's what the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Eugene Wigner described as the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics.
This is like putting on rose-colored glasses and thinking what an amazing coincidence it is that everything we look at with those glasses on appears to be rose-colored. The reason the universe can be described in mathematics is because we look at it through math-colored glasses. We invented math for the purpose of describing the universe. So why would we think it's such an amazing coincidence that it does, in fact, describe the universe?
Again, is it just a happy coincidence?
No, and I've never heard anyone claim that it is. Of course it's not a coincidence that the system we devised to effectively conceptualize our experiences does, in fact, effectively conceptualize our experiences. It's not a coincidence that math works, it works because we designed it to work.
And again, I think luck isn't a satisfactory explanation here. It makes more sense to believe that there's a mind behind this language of the universe.
There are several minds behind it. Those minds are the minds of the human beings who invented it.
Secondly, I believe God makes sense of human value. Last year was the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I imagine that everyone in this room celebrates the values of equality, dignity, and personhood that it embodies. The question is, why? Why should we treat each other as having these intrinsic value and inviolable rights?
Ultimately because we want to. Whether there is a God or not, you're never going to get closer to an objective justification for morality than that. Even if there is a God who dictates that we ought to value these things, what objective reason is there to obey what a God dictates? The existence of a God does not answer that question in any non-circular way.
But we know, don't we, that there are ways that we should treat each other as humans, that some things are objectively right and wrong, regardless of what our evolutionary history or culture happens to have delivered us.
Really? How do we know that? All I know is that there are actions which are intolerable to my conscience. Those actions would be intolerable to my conscience if there is a God, if there is no God, and even if there is a God that commands me to tolerate them. The existence of a God is entirely inconsequential with respect to my morality.
So for me, whereas atheism fails to account for this human value, Christianity has a ready explanation. In fact, from page 1 of the Bible, we're told that humans are made in the image of God. And not just that God came in the person of Jesus ultimately to die for us. And that invests humans with ultimate dignity and value.
How? How does that logically follow at all? Even if it's true that there is a God who died for our sake, that's only evidence that this God values us. It would be a complete non sequitur to infer that anyone else therefore ought to value us. Now, of course, I do happen to value people, but I don't see why a God valuing us means that I therefore ought to value people.
He believes there's no such thing as free will. We live in a closed system, a universe of purely material cause and effect. What that means is you had no choice of being here. You had no choice in the clothes you're wearing or the millions of large or tiny decisions that you make every day. In the end, it's just about atoms and electrons doing their thing. There's actually not even a you to speak of, just a collection of utterly predetermined processes going on in your brain. Determinism also means that if you're a Christian here tonight, you didn't choose to be, and if you're an atheist, you didn't choose to be. The universe chose it for you. One brain happens to fizz in one way that makes them an atheist, and another brain happens to fizz in another way that makes them a Christian.
Wow, does this dude not have a single original idea? I've heard Frank Turek make this argument, and it fails to show how determinism undermines reason. Justin doesn't even seem to understand how reason works. Regardless of whether human beings' choices are determined, reason is deterministic. Reason says that certain conclusions necessarily follow from certain premises. What's free about that? If I believe that Paris is in France and France is in Europe, I don't freely choose to believe that Paris is therefore in Europe. I can't help but believe it, because if I believe that the first two premises are true, I can't make any sense of the conclusion not being true. If I were to take the liberty of freely choosing a contrary conclusion, then I wouldn't be reasoning. I would just be believing random nonsense. Reasoning is not free. Justin himself defined being rational as believing in something with good evidence, but how is that free? If you believe in something because you're following where the evidence points you, you're not freely choosing to believe in that thing. You are letting the evidence choose for you.
And in the end, there's nothing true or false about the activity of electrons in our brains.
Sure there is. If that electrical activity models some other process in a way that produces predictions of how that process will behave, and those predictions match experience, then for all intents and purposes, that pattern of electrical activity can quite sensibly be called true. If it fails to do that, then it can quite sensibly be called false.
But you might be starting to see the problem now. You see, if we never choose our beliefs, but they're handed to us by a non-rational, determined process, then we haven't actually arrived at them through a process of reasoning.
Exactly the opposite is true. It's only if we follow deterministic logical rules that we are reasoning. If we are simply freely choosing conclusions rather than arriving at them by following rules or following where the evidence points, then we are not reasoning. Again, we would just be believing random nonsense.
That's why atheistic determinism fundamentally undermines the concept of reason to begin with. That means that Stephen and his fellow atheists have effectively sawn off the branch that they're sitting on. For us to have any confidence in deterministic materialism, we have to believe we've got good reasons for it. But if we had no choice about coming to those beliefs, then we've no reason to say they're good. It's utterly self-defeating.
It's only if our conclusions are the product of the application of logical rules rather than free choice that we can say that those conclusions are rational.
Now, the only way out of this pickle is if there is some kind of guarantor of reason, and I believe God is that guarantor. If there's a God, then we aren't in this closed system. Our sense that we are actually free and that we can use reason to arrive at our beliefs, well, that makes sense if God creates us with genuine freedom to choose.
In addition to thinking that reasoning requires free choice when it actually requires the application of strict rules, Justin also assumes that a materialistic universe is necessarily deterministic, and that only a God can make entities that do not behave in predetermined ways. This is another non sequitur.
Finally, look, I kind of made a case for God here, but what about the Christian one? Is there a way of knowing which God? I think we already have some clues to this along the way, but the point is, it's at this point really that we come to the person of Jesus. If the central claim at the heart of Christian faith is that Jesus died and rose again, well, if that's true, then we have a good reason for believing his claim that he was God.
No, we don't. It certainly doesn't follow deductively that if a person has the power to return from the dead, that they are an all-powerful God. And it would be a huge and wildly irrational leap to even inductively infer such a thing. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.